I worked overtime for 5 years to afford our dream home, but my wife sold it without telling me. The real estate agent standing in my driveway looked confused when I asked her why she was measuring my front lawn. She held up her tablet showing a listing photo of my house, the brick colonial I'd spent 5 years of overtime shifts to buy, and said the new owners wanted to know if there was room for a second garage. I stood there in my work boots with grease still under my fingernails from the morning shift at the plant, staring at a for sale sign I'd never seen before planted in the yard where my son learned to ride his bike. The agent tilted her head and asked if I was the landscaper. I told her I was the homeowner. She checked her tablet twice, looked back at me, and said the house sold 3 weeks ago. Cash sale. Already closed. I laughed because my brain couldn't process what she was saying as real. Then my hands started shaking so hard I dropped my lunchbox on the driveway and watched it split open, spilling my thermos across the concrete. I met Vanessa 11 years ago at a community college night class where we were both trying to finish degrees we'd started and abandoned years earlier. She was working as a dental hygienist, and I was pulling double shifts at the automotive plant, and we bonded over being the oldest students in a room full of kids fresh out of high school. She had this way of making everything seem manageable, like life was just a series of small problems you could solve with enough planning. We got married 8 months later at the courthouse because neither of us wanted the expense of a big wedding. Our son Owen was born a year after that, and Vanessa quit her job to stay home with him. I picked up overtime whenever it was offered because one income meant we were always close to the edge financially. We lived in a cramped apartment in a neighborhood where I heard gunshots every few weeks and watched drug deals happen in the parking lot outside our window. Vanessa talked constantly about wanting a real house with a yard and good schools, somewhere safe for Owen to grow up. I wanted that too, maybe more than anything I'd ever wanted in my life. The overtime started 5 years before the day I found that real estate agent in my driveway. My supervisor at the plant, a man named Leonard who'd worked there for 32 years, pulled me aside one Friday and said they needed someone on the weekend maintenance crew. Time and a half on Saturdays, double time on Sundays, and the work was steady if I wanted it. I told Vanessa that night over dinner in our apartment that smelled like the Indian restaurant downstairs, and she got this look on her face like I'd just told her we won the lottery. She pulled out her phone and started calculating what we could save in a year, 2 years, 5 years, if I took every weekend shift they offered. Her eyes went bright when she showed me the numbers, and she said we could actually buy a house, a real house, not some rundown fixer-upper but something nice in a decent neighborhood. I remember watching her excitement and feeling like I could do this, like sacrificing my weekends for 5 years was worth it if it meant giving my family the life they deserved. Owen was 3 years old and asking why we didn't have a backyard like his friend from daycare, and I wanted to be able to tell him soon instead of someday. The first year was brutal in ways I hadn't anticipated. Working 65 to 70 hours a week meant I barely saw Owen awake. I left before he woke up most mornings and came home after his bedtime most nights. Weekends became just 2 more workdays instead of family time. Vanessa handled it better than I expected, or at least she said she did. She told me she understood this was temporary and that she could manage Owen and the household alone if it meant we were building toward something. I trusted her completely because she'd never given me a reason not to. Every month I transferred my overtime pay into our joint savings account and watched the balance grow. Vanessa tracked every dollar in a spreadsheet she showed me during our Sunday evening budget meetings, back when I still had Sunday evenings free. She color-coded our progress toward the down payment goal and put little milestone markers at 25%, 50%, 75% saved. When we hit each marker, she'd make my favorite dinner and we'd celebrate like we'd already bought the house. Those celebrations kept me going through shifts where I was so tired I could barely stand. By year 3, I stopped trying to calculate how many hours I'd worked or how many family dinners I'd missed. The numbers were too depressing. Owen was 6 and had stopped asking me to play catch because he'd learned I was never home. Vanessa assured me he understood, that she explained to him why Daddy worked so much, that he knew it was for our future house. I saw my son growing up in these little snapshots, like he'd age a month between the times I actually had a full conversation with him. My parents commented that I looked exhausted every time they saw me, which wasn't often because I worked most holidays for the holiday pay bonus. My mother pulled me aside at Christmas during year 4 and asked if all this overtime was really worth it, if I was sacrificing too much time with my family. I told her it was temporary and that Vanessa and I had a plan. She didn't look convinced, but she dropped it. I wish now I'd listened to the concern in her voice instead of dismissing it as her not understanding our situation. If you are enjoying this story already, please subscribe to see more stories like this. We bought the house at the end of year 5, 3 months before the real estate agent showed up in my driveway. Vanessa found it through a friend who knew about the listing before it went public. It was a 4-bedroom brick colonial in a neighborhood called Meadowbrook Estates, with actual trees lining the streets and a park 2 blocks away. The schools were rated excellent, the crime rate was basically non-existent, and there was a 2-car garage and a fenced backyard big enough for Owen to run around in. The asking price was $380,000, which was more than I'd ever imagined spending on anything, but we had $85,000 saved for the down payment. Vanessa handled all the paperwork because I was working 70-hour weeks and barely had time to sleep, let alone deal with real estate contracts and mortgage applications. She told me what to sign and where, and I signed everything, trusting that she'd read it all carefully. The day we closed, I took a rare day off work, and we walked through our new house with Owen running ahead of us, exploring every room. Vanessa cried happy tears in the master bedroom and told me this was everything she'd dreamed of, that my 5 years of sacrifice had made this possible. I felt proud standing there, like I'd actually achieved something significant for my family. We moved in on a Saturday in August, and I took the weekend off from overtime for the first time in 5 years to help. Owen claimed the bedroom with the window overlooking the backyard and spent the whole day arranging his toys on the new shelves Vanessa had bought. She decorated the house exactly how she'd always wanted, ordering furniture and artwork and curtains that she said matched the style of the neighborhood. I didn't pay much attention to the costs because we'd just spent 5 years saving, and I figured she'd earned the right to make our house feel like home. I went back to overtime the following Monday because we still had a mortgage payment every month and only one income. Vanessa said she might look for part-time work once Owen started 3rd grade in the fall, but she wanted to enjoy the house first after waiting so long for it. That made sense to me. She'd waited 5 years while I worked weekends. She deserved a few months to just appreciate what we'd built together. The first sign that something was wrong came 6 weeks after we moved in, though I didn't recognize it as a warning at the time. I came home from a double shift around 11 at night and found Vanessa sitting at the kitchen table with her laptop open and papers spread everywhere. She looked stressed in a way I hadn't seen before, and when I asked what was wrong, she said she was just organizing our finances and getting everything set up with the new mortgage. I offered to help, but she said she had it under control and I should get some sleep since I had another early shift. I trusted her completely and went to bed without asking more questions. Looking back now, I see that moment differently. The papers she was reviewing weren't mortgage documents. They were real estate market analyses and home value assessments. She was already planning to sell the house I'd barely lived in for a month. 3 weeks after that kitchen table scene, Vanessa started mentioning that some of her friends thought we'd overpaid for the house. She'd bring it up casually during dinner or while we were watching television, saying things like her friend Diane thought the market in our neighborhood was overvalued, or her friend Rebecca heard that property taxes were going up next year. I didn't think much of it because people always have opinions about other people's financial decisions, and I figured Vanessa was just venting about annoying comments from friends. She also started talking about how the commute to Owen's new school was longer than she'd expected and how the neighborhood felt more isolated than she'd thought it would. I reminded her that she'd chosen this house specifically because of the school district and the quiet neighborhood. She agreed, but said experiencing something daily was different from imagining it. I suggested we give it more time to adjust. She nodded and dropped the subject, but I noticed she seemed distracted and distant in a way that felt new. A month later, I got a call from my mother asking if Vanessa was okay because she'd called asking to borrow $15,000 for an emergency home repair. I told my mother we hadn't had any emergency repairs and asked when Vanessa called. My mother said it was earlier that morning, and she'd told Vanessa she needed to check with my father before lending that much money. I thanked her for calling me and said I'd talk to Vanessa about it. When I got home that evening, I asked Vanessa about the call to my mother. Her face went red, and she said she'd panicked because she thought we had a foundation issue based on some cracks she'd noticed, but then the contractor told her it was nothing serious, and she forgot to call my mother back to say never mind. The explanation felt off, because Vanessa wasn't the type to panic about house repairs without researching them first, but I accepted it because I couldn't imagine why she'd lie about something like that. I told her to please loop me in on house issues before calling my parents for money, and she apologized and promised she would. I should have pushed harder for details, but I was too exhausted from working 12-hour shifts to question her story the way I should have. 2 weeks after the phone call incident, I came home early from work because of the equipment malfunction that shut down the production line. It was barely 3 in the afternoon, and I found Vanessa on the phone in our bedroom with the door closed. I could hear her voice through the door saying something about timeline and pricing. When she came out and saw me standing in the hallway, she looked startled and asked why I was home. I explained about the shutdown, and she said she'd been on the phone with a contractor about getting the gutters cleaned. I asked which contractor because I could do the gutters myself on the weekend to save money, and she said she'd already hung up and couldn't remember the company name. That answer bothered me because Vanessa always remembered details like that. She was the organized one who kept track of everything. I let it go because I didn't want to start a fight over something as small as gutter cleaning, but the interaction stuck in my mind as strange. The real estate agent in my driveway happened 3 days after the gutter cleaning phone call. I'd been at work since 5:30 that morning, and I came home around 2 because we finished a major project early. I pulled into my driveway and saw a woman in a navy blue blazer measuring the front yard with one of those rolling wheel devices. I got out of my truck and walked over to ask what she was doing. She introduced herself as Patricia Montgomery from Prestige Realty and said she was just doing some measurements for the new owners. I asked what new owners, and she looked at me like I was stupid. She pulled up her tablet and showed me the listing for my house, complete with interior photos I'd never seen anyone take. The listing said, "Sold," in red letters across the top. I told her there must be a mistake because I owned this house, and she checked her paperwork and told me the sale closed 3 weeks ago on September 15th. I said that was impossible because I lived here and nobody had sold anything. She asked my name, and when I told her, she scrolled through her documents and said my name wasn't on the title or the closing papers. She showed me the documentation, and the only name listed was Vanessa's. Not both of our names, just hers. I walked into my house feeling like the ground was tilting under my feet. Vanessa was in the kitchen making Owen a snack, and she looked up when I came in. I asked her why a real estate agent was in our driveway talking about new owners, and her face went completely white. Owen was sitting at the kitchen table with his homework spread out, so I told him to go to his room for a few minutes because Mom and Dad needed to talk about adult stuff. He looked worried, but went upstairs without arguing. As soon as I heard his bedroom door close, I asked Vanessa what the hell was going on. She sat down at the kitchen table and put her face in her hands. When she looked up, she had tears running down her cheeks, and she said she'd made a terrible mistake. She told me she'd sold the house 3 weeks ago because we were about to lose it anyway. I asked what she meant by lose it, and she said she'd taken out a second mortgage 6 months before we even bought this house, using our old apartment as collateral, and she couldn't make the payments anymore. None of what she was saying made any sense because we'd never owned our apartment. We'd rented it. I sat down across from Vanessa and asked her to explain everything from the beginning. She took a shaky breath and told me she'd been gambling online for the past 3 years. She started small, just playing poker for fun, but then she found high-stakes sites where she could win thousands of dollars in a single night. She'd won big a few times early on, which made her believe she was actually good at it. Then she started losing. She lost the money she'd won, then she started dipping into our savings to chase her losses. By the time we were ready to buy the house, she'd gambled away $40,000 of the $85,000 we'd saved. She panicked and took out personal loans to cover the missing money so I wouldn't notice. Then she had to make loan payments every month on top of our regular expenses, and she couldn't keep up. She said she'd put the house in only her name because her credit was actually better than mine, which was a lie I'd believed because I'd never checked. The real reason was that she could sell the house without my signature if it was only in her name. I asked Vanessa where the money from the house sale went, and she said it went to pay off the personal loans and the remaining balance on the original down payment fraud. She said after everything was paid, there was about $30,000 left. I asked where that $30,000 was, and she said she'd gambled most of it trying to win enough to fix everything before I found out. She said she was down to about $8,000 now. I sat there listening to her confess that she'd stolen 5 years of my life, gambling away every weekend I'd worked, every dinner I'd missed with my son, every hour of overtime I'd logged, and I felt nothing. Not anger, not sadness, just this vast, empty nothing where emotions should have been. I asked when we had to be out of the house, and she said the new owners took possession in 10 days. I asked where she planned for us to live, and she started crying harder and said she didn't know. She'd been hoping to win enough money to buy the house back before the sale closed. I got up from the table and walked out of the room because I couldn't look at her anymore without feeling like I was going to physically collapse. I called my brother Desmond that night from my truck parked in the driveway because I couldn't stay in the house. I told him everything Vanessa had confessed, and he was quiet for a long time before asking if I was sure she was telling me the truth. I said I didn't know what to believe anymore, but a real estate agent had showed me closing papers with Vanessa's signature and a sale date 3 weeks ago. Desmond said I needed a lawyer immediately, like tomorrow morning immediately. He gave me the name of an attorney he knew from work, someone who specialized in fraud and asset recovery. I called the attorney's office first thing the next morning and got an appointment for that afternoon. I had to call in sick to work for the first time in 5 years, which felt absurd given that I was losing my house, but still worried about attendance points at my job. The attorney's name was Malcolm Rivers, and he'd been practicing family and fraud law for 19 years, according to the degrees on his wall. He listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he asked if I had any documentation of my overtime payments or my contributions to the down payment. I said everything had gone into our joint savings account, and I could get bank statements going back 5 years. He said that was good, and asked if my name was on the original purchase contract for the house, even if it wasn't on the title. I said Vanessa had handled all the paperwork, and I'd only signed where she told me to sign. Malcolm's face got serious, and he said that was going to be a problem, because it sounded like Vanessa had structured everything to exclude me from ownership legally. He asked if I had any evidence that I'd agreed to put the house solely in her name, and I said no because I hadn't known the house was solely in her name until yesterday. Malcolm sat back in his chair and told me the situation was worse than I'd probably realized. If the house was legally only Vanessa's property, and if she'd sold it and used the proceeds to pay her debts, I might not have any legal recourse to recover my contributions. My best option was to file for divorce immediately and try to recoup my financial losses through the divorce settlement, but even that wasn't guaranteed. I asked Malcolm what I should do about the fact that we had to be out of the house in 9 days and had nowhere to go. He said I should document everything, get copies of all bank statements showing my overtime deposits, save any communications with Vanessa about the house, and start looking for temporary housing. He recommended I also file a police report for fraud though he warned me that financial fraud between spouses was complicated and might not result in criminal charges. I asked if there was any way to stop the sale or reverse it, and he said not, if the sale had already closed and the money had been spent. The new owners were innocent buyers who'd paid fair market value. Going after them wasn't going to help me. My only target was Vanessa, and she'd apparently already spent almost everything. I walked out of Malcolm's office feeling more hopeless than when I'd walked in, which I hadn't thought was possible. If this story keeps your interest, please subscribe to get more stories like this. I went home that evening and told Vanessa I was filing for divorce and that she needed to find somewhere else to stay. She begged me to reconsider, saying she was sick and needed help, not abandonment. She said gambling addiction was a real disease and she wanted to get treatment. I told her she should have thought about that before she stole my house. She said it wasn't stealing because we were married and what's mine was hers. I said apparently what's mine was hers, but what's hers was only hers, based on whose name was on the title. She started crying again, and Owen came downstairs asking why we were yelling. I hadn't realized I was yelling until my son pointed it out. Vanessa told Owen everything was fine and sent him back upstairs. I told her she had 48 hours to tell Owen we were getting divorced and that we were losing the house, or I would tell him myself. She said I was being cruel, and I said she'd gambled away his childhood home and his college fund, so maybe she should think about cruelty from his perspective. I called my parents that night and asked if I could stay with them temporarily. My mother said, of course, and asked what happened. I gave her the short version, and she got very quiet before saying she'd known something was wrong when Vanessa called asking for money. She said she wished she'd pushed harder to find out what was really going on. I told her it wasn't her fault, that Vanessa had lied to both of us. My father got on the phone and said I could stay as long as I needed, and Owen too if Vanessa wasn't fit to take care of him. I thanked them and said I'd move some of my things over in the next few days. My mother asked if I was okay, and I said no, but I would be eventually. She didn't sound convinced, and honestly, neither was I. The next day, I went to the police station and filed a report for financial fraud like Malcolm had suggested. The officer who took my report was a detective named Gregory Shaw, 23 years with the department, and he listened to my story with a skeptical expression. When I finished, he asked if I had proof that Vanessa had taken money without my knowledge. I said she'd been stealing from our joint account for 3 years and had forged loan applications in my name. He asked if I'd actually seen the forged documents, and I said no, but Vanessa had admitted to taking out loans. Detective Shaw explained that taking money from a joint account wasn't theft legally because both parties had equal access to the funds, and if I hadn't actually seen forged loan applications with my signature, I couldn't prove they existed. He said what Vanessa did was morally wrong, but it might not be criminally wrong depending on how she'd structured everything. I asked what I was supposed to do then, and he said I should pursue this through family court in my divorce proceedings. He took my report and said he'd look into it, but his tone made it clear he didn't think anything would come of it. I filed for divorce 2 days later with Malcolm's help. We requested an emergency hearing to address the immediate financial fraud and the missing assets. The judge assigned to our case was named Patricia Thornton, and she'd been on the family court bench for 11 years according to the court website. The emergency hearing was scheduled for the following week, which meant I had about 3 days left in the house before the new owners took possession. Malcolm advised me to move out before then to avoid any confrontation or trespassing issues. I spent those 3 days packing everything I owned into boxes and trying to explain to Owen why we were leaving the house he'd lived in for less than 3 months. He didn't understand, and honestly, I didn't have a good way to explain it that wouldn't make him hate his mother. I told him sometimes grown-ups make mistakes with money, and we have to move because of those mistakes. He asked if we'd get another house someday, and I said I didn't know. He cried into his pillow that night, and I sat on the edge of his bed feeling like the biggest failure as a father because I couldn't protect him from this. I moved into my parents' house on the day the new owners were supposed to take possession. My parents lived in a small ranch house with 2 bedrooms, and they gave me their spare room while Owen slept on an air mattress on the floor next to my bed. The whole situation felt humiliating for someone who'd spent 5 years working overtime to avoid exactly this kind of financial disaster. My father tried to be supportive by not asking too many questions, but I could see the disappointment in his eyes every time he looked at me. My mother kept making comments about how she'd never trusted Vanessa, which wasn't helpful, but probably made her feel better. Owen started acting out at school, getting into fights, and refusing to do his homework. His teacher called me in for a conference and asked what was going on at home. I gave her a vague explanation about family stress and promised to work with Owen on his behavior. She looked sympathetic, but also concerned, and I left that meeting feeling like I was failing at everything simultaneously. The emergency divorce hearing happened a week after I moved out of my house. Vanessa showed up with her own attorney, a woman named Rita Campbell who specialized in defending gambling addicts in divorce cases. Rita argued that Vanessa had a documented mental illness and that her actions were the result of addiction, not malicious intent. She presented letters from a therapist Vanessa had apparently been seeing for 2 weeks, stating that Vanessa suffered from gambling disorder and was committed to treatment. Malcolm argued that mental illness didn't excuse fraud and that Vanessa had deliberately hidden her gambling and structured the house purchase to exclude me from ownership. Judge Thornton listened to both sides and then asked Vanessa directly how much money she'd gambled away over the past 3 years. Vanessa said approximately $120,000. The judge asked where that money came from, and Vanessa admitted it came from our joint savings, from personal loans she'd taken out, and from the proceeds of selling our house. Judge Thornton asked if Vanessa understood that she'd stolen her husband's 5 years of overtime work and gambled it away. Vanessa started crying and said she understood now, but she'd been in the grip of addiction and hadn't been thinking clearly. Judge Thornton ordered Vanessa to provide complete financial disclosure within 10 days, including all bank statements, loan documents, and gambling site records for the past 3 years. She also ordered Vanessa to undergo a psychological evaluation to determine if she was genuinely suffering from gambling disorder or if she was using it as a legal strategy. The judge said she was skeptical of sudden diagnoses that appeared conveniently after someone got caught committing fraud. Rita objected, saying that questioning her client's mental health diagnosis was inappropriate, but Judge Thornton overruled her and said the timing of the diagnosis warranted scrutiny. The judge also froze what remained of the house sale proceeds and ordered Vanessa not to access any joint accounts or take on any new debt. She set a follow-up hearing for 3 weeks later to review the financial disclosure and the psychological evaluation results. I walked out of that courtroom feeling like maybe, possibly, someone was actually listening to what Vanessa had done to me. The financial disclosure that Vanessa's attorney submitted 2 weeks later was even worse than I'd imagined. According to the bank statements, Vanessa had been gambling online almost daily for 3 years. Some days she'd lose hundreds of dollars, some days thousands. Her biggest single loss was $18,000 in one night. She'd opened 6 different personal loans over 2 years, totaling $95,000, and had forged my signature on 3 of them. The loan documents were included in the disclosure, and seeing my signature forged on official paperwork made me physically sick. She'd also opened 2 credit cards in my name without my knowledge, and maxed them both out cash advancing money to fund her gambling. My credit score had dropped from 720 to 515, without me knowing. The gambling site records showed that over 3 years, she'd deposited $137,000 and withdrawn $21,000, meaning she'd net lost $116,000. The $8,000 she'd mentioned having left from the house sale was actually closer to $4,000, according to her current bank balance. Malcolm filed a motion for emergency relief based on the financial disclosure, asking the court to order Vanessa to repay me for the forged loans and the stolen savings. He also requested that the court require Vanessa to enter an inpatient treatment program for gambling addiction at her own expense. Rita Campbell objected to both requests, arguing that Vanessa couldn't repay money she didn't have, and that inpatient treatment would prevent her from working to earn money to eventually repay me. Judge Thornton scheduled another hearing to address Malcolm's motion. At that hearing, the judge asked Vanessa if she had any assets left that could be liquidated to begin repaying me. Vanessa said she had a car worth about $12,000 and some jewelry worth maybe $3,000. The judge ordered her to sell both and put the proceeds in an escrow account pending the final divorce settlement. Vanessa started to object, but her attorney put a hand on her arm to stop her. Judge Thornton also ordered Vanessa to get a job within 30 days and to begin making monthly payments toward restitution once she was employed. The judge said that while she couldn't force Vanessa into inpatient treatment without a formal mental health commitment, she was ordering outpatient treatment twice weekly with progress reports sent to the court monthly. The psychological evaluation results came back 3 days before our next scheduled hearing. The psychologist who evaluated Vanessa was a doctor named Lawrence Mitchell, and he'd been conducting forensic psychological evaluations for family court for 16 years. His report was 23 pages long, and Malcolm sent me a copy the day he received it. Dr. Mitchell's assessment was that Vanessa did meet the diagnostic criteria for gambling disorder, but that her level of insight into her behavior and her ability to conceal it for 3 years suggested she had more cognitive control than typical gambling addicts. He noted that Vanessa had been able to maintain her deception through elaborate planning, including structuring the house purchase to exclude me, forging loan documents, and creating fake explanations for her behavior when questioned. This level of executive function and planning was inconsistent with someone in the grip of a purely compulsive disorder. His opinion was that Vanessa's gambling was problematic and met clinical criteria for addiction, but that she'd also made deliberate choices to deceive me and to prioritize her gambling over her family's financial security. He recommended treatment, but also noted that treatment success would depend on Vanessa's willingness to accept full responsibility for her actions rather than hiding behind her diagnosis. At the next hearing, Judge Thornton reviewed Dr. Mitchell's report and asked Vanessa if she agreed with his assessment. Vanessa said she disagreed with the part about deliberate deception because she'd been in denial about how bad her gambling had gotten. The judge asked her to explain how someone in denial manages to forge loan documents and structure a real estate purchase to hide assets from their spouse. Vanessa didn't have a good answer. Judge Thornton said the court acknowledged that Vanessa had a gambling disorder, but that didn't absolve her of responsibility for the fraud she'd committed. The judge ordered that in the final divorce settlement, Vanessa would be responsible for all the debt she'd incurred, including the forged loans. She also ordered that any remaining assets from the house sale, plus proceeds from selling Vanessa's car and jewelry, would go to me as partial restitution for my stolen overtime earnings. The judge calculated that I'd worked approximately 2,600 overtime hours over 5 years, earning roughly $98,000 in overtime pay that went into our joint account. Vanessa had gambled away that money, plus our original savings, plus borrowed money. Judge Thornton said she was ordering Vanessa to repay me a minimum of $50,000 over the next 10 years through monthly payments once she was employed. If Vanessa failed to make payments, the court would garnish her wages. Vanessa's attorney tried to argue that a $50,000 restitution order was unrealistic given her client's earning potential and debt load, but Judge Thornton said her client should have thought about that before committing fraud. The judge also ordered that I would have sole physical custody of Owen, with Vanessa getting supervised visitation until she could demonstrate 6 months of sobriety from gambling and stable employment. Vanessa broke down crying in the courtroom, saying I was taking her son away from her. Judge Thornton said Vanessa had taken her son's home and financial security away from him, so perhaps she should consider the consequences of her own actions. The judge finalized the divorce that day, which was faster than typical because of the documented fraud and the emergency circumstances. I walked out of that courthouse legally divorced and with a court order for restitution, but I still didn't have my house back, and I still had less than $5,000 to my name. The following week, Detective Shaw called me and said he'd reviewed the loan documents Vanessa's attorney had submitted to family court. He said the forged signatures on 3 of the loans constituted identity theft and fraud, which were criminal offenses. He asked if I wanted to press charges against Vanessa. I sat in my truck in my work parking lot during my lunch break and thought about what pressing criminal charges would mean. Vanessa could go to jail, which would mean Owen would definitely end up with me full-time, but would also mean growing up knowing his mother was in prison. I asked Detective Shaw what the likely outcome would be if I pressed charges. He said given the amount of money involved and the clear evidence of forgery, the prosecutor would probably offer a plea deal for probation and restitution rather than jail time, especially since this was a first offense and Vanessa had a documented mental health issue. I asked if the restitution from a criminal case would be in addition to or instead of the family court restitution. He said it would typically be structured to run concurrent, meaning she'd be paying one restitution order that satisfied both courts. I decided to press charges because I wanted Vanessa to face actual consequences beyond just owing me money she couldn't pay. The criminal case moved surprisingly quickly. The prosecutor assigned to my case was a woman named Diana Foster, who'd been handling white-collar crimes for 12 years. She reviewed the evidence Detective Shaw had compiled and said it was one of the clearer fraud cases she'd seen because the forged signatures were obviously not mine and the timeline of Vanessa's deception was well documented through bank records. Diana said she'd offer Vanessa a plea deal, plead guilty to 3 counts of identity theft and fraud, accept 5 years of probation, complete an inpatient gambling treatment program, maintain employment, and pay restitution of $50,000 over 10 years. If Vanessa rejected the plea, Diana would take the case to trial and push for prison time. Vanessa's criminal defense attorney, a man named Patrick Montgomery, advised her to take the plea. The plea hearing happened 6 weeks after the divorce was finalized. Vanessa stood in front of a criminal court judge named Albert Dawson and admitted to stealing my identity to take out loans and to deliberately defrauding me over 3 years. Judge Dawson accepted the plea and sentenced her according to the agreement. He also lectured her about the seriousness of stealing from her own family and told her she was lucky her husband was showing mercy by not pushing for prison time. I didn't feel merciful sitting in that courtroom watching Vanessa accept her plea deal. I felt exhausted and empty and like I'd aged 10 years in the past 3 months. Owen was living with me full-time at my parents' house, and he'd started asking questions about why he couldn't see his mom except during supervised visits. I tried to explain it in age-appropriate terms, but how do you tell your 8-year-old son that his mother is a criminal who stole his college fund to gamble online? I settled for saying Mom made some bad choices and needed to fix them before she could have regular time with him again. He asked if we'd ever get our house back, and I had to tell him no. That house belonged to someone else now. He asked if we'd get a different house, and I said someday when I saved up enough money again. He asked how long that would take, and I said I didn't know. He cried himself to sleep that night, and I stood outside his door listening to him sob and feeling like Vanessa had stolen more than just money from us. I went back to working overtime about 2 months after everything settled. Leonard, my supervisor, had been understanding about my situation because I'd always been a reliable worker and the plant Grapevine had shared the basics of what happened. He offered me weekend shifts again, and I took them because I needed to rebuild my savings and because staying busy kept me from thinking too much about what I'd lost. My parents were helpful with Owen, but I could tell the 3-generation living situation was wearing on everyone. My mother made comments about Owen needing his own room and a stable environment. My father kept suggesting I look into buying a small condo or townhouse, something affordable that would at least be ours. I looked at my bank balance and my credit score and tried to imagine how long it would take to save for another down payment with a 515 credit score and a bankruptcy on my record from the debt Vanessa had left me with. The math was depressing. 6 months after the divorce finalized, I got a call from Diana Foster saying Vanessa had violated her probation by failing to complete her inpatient treatment program. Vanessa had checked herself into a 30-day program like the plea deal required, but she'd left after 9 days claiming the program wasn't a good fit. Diana said she was filing a motion to revoke Vanessa's probation and asking the judge to impose jail time. I asked what that would mean for Owen, and Diana said it wasn't her decision to make, but that violating probation this blatantly didn't give the judge many options. The probation violation hearing happened 2 weeks later. Vanessa showed up looking terrible, like she hadn't slept in days. Her attorney Patrick argued that his client had left the treatment program because it wasn't specifically designed for gambling addiction, and that she'd been attending outpatient therapy twice weekly, like her family court order required. Diana presented evidence that Vanessa had gambled online 3 times since leaving the treatment program, depositing and losing a total of $2,000 she'd borrowed from a friend. Judge Dawson asked Vanessa where she'd gotten $2,000 to gamble when she was supposed to be paying restitution. Vanessa said her friend had loaned it to her for living expenses, and she'd made a mistake using it for gambling instead. The judge said that wasn't a mistake, that was a choice, and it demonstrated she wasn't taking her probation seriously. He revoked her probation and sentenced her to 18 months in county jail with credit for time served. I didn't feel victorious watching Vanessa get taken into custody. I felt sad for Owen, who would now spend the next 1.5 years with his mother in jail. I felt angry that Vanessa had learned nothing from everything that had happened, and I felt tired of the whole situation taking up so much space in my life. I drove to my parents' house after the hearing and told Owen that his mom was going to be away for a while because she broke some rules and needed to face consequences. He asked if she was in jail, and I said yes. He asked if it was because of the gambling, and I said yes. He got very quiet, and then he asked if she'd ever come back. I told him she would come back eventually, but that when she did, she'd need to prove she'd changed before he could spend unsupervised time with her. He nodded like he understood, but his eyes looked older than 8 years old should look. I hugged him and told him none of this was his fault and that I loved him no matter what. He hugged me back and whispered that he was glad he lived with me and not her. That broke my heart in a different way than Vanessa's betrayal had. A year after the divorce, I'd saved about $12,000 working overtime. My credit score had climbed back to 590 through making consistent payments on the debt I'd been left with. I was still living at my parents' house, and Owen was still sleeping on an air mattress next to my bed. I started looking at rental houses in decent school districts, figuring that renting was more realistic than buying given my financial situation. I found a small 3-bedroom house about 15 minutes from my parents, and the landlord was willing to overlook my credit score because I could show proof of consistent employment and overtime income. I signed a lease and moved Owen and myself out of my parents' house in March. Owen got his own bedroom for the first time in a year, and I set it up with furniture from thrift stores and paint I picked out myself. He wanted his walls blue, and I painted them on a Saturday while he was at my parents' house. When he came home and saw his room, he ran in circles shouting about how cool it looked. That was the first time I'd seen him genuinely happy in months. Vanessa was released from jail after serving 13 months with good behavior. Her probation officer contacted me to let me know she'd been released and that she was living in a halfway house while she looked for employment. The family court order still required her to complete 6 months of gambling sobriety and stable employment before she could have unsupervised visitation with Owen. I told Owen his mom was out of jail and would be able to see him for supervised visits soon. He asked if he had to see her, and I said that was up to him, but that she was still his mother and probably wanted to rebuild their relationship. He thought about it and said he'd see her, but only if I was there too. I told him the visits would be supervised by a court-appointed person, not me, but that I'd be nearby if he needed me. His first visit with Vanessa happened at a supervised visitation center downtown. I dropped him off and waited in my truck in the parking lot. When I picked him up an hour later, he was quiet. I asked how it went, and he said Mom cried a lot and said she was sorry. I asked if he believed her, and he said he didn't know. I told him he didn't have to decide right now how he felt about everything. 2 years after the divorce, I'd saved enough for a down payment on a small townhouse. My credit score had climbed to 643, and I qualified for an FHA loan with a higher interest rate but manageable payments. I bought a 2-bedroom townhouse in a decent neighborhood about 20 minutes from my work. It wasn't the 4-bedroom colonial in Meadowbrook Estates, but it was mine and Owen's, and nobody could sell it without my permission. Owen helped me pick out paint colors for his room, and we spent weekends fixing up the place together. He'd grown into a thoughtful 10-year-old who asked smart questions about money and trust and consequences. I tried to answer honestly without making Vanessa into a villain, but the truth was complicated and not always flattering to her. Vanessa had completed her required gambling treatment and employment requirements and had graduated to unsupervised visitation with Owen. He saw her every other weekend, and she'd rented a small apartment across town. She was working as a dental hygienist again and making her monthly restitution payments mostly on time. She'd paid back about $8,000 of the $50,000 she owed, which meant she'd be making payments until Owen graduated college. I stopped working as much overtime after we moved into the townhouse. I'd learned that working 70-hour weeks meant missing my son's childhood, and I'd already missed too much. Leonard understood when I cut back to just Saturday overtime, and my income dropped, but my presence in Owen's life increased. I made it to his school events and his soccer games and our weekend trips to the park. I cooked dinner most nights instead of coming home after he was asleep. I read books with him before bed and helped with his homework and listened to him talk about his day. The version of fatherhood I was living now looked nothing like the 5 years I'd spent working overtime for a dream that turned out to be built on lies, but it was real and present and mine. Owen told me one night that he liked our townhouse better than the big house because I was actually home now. That comment made me realize that Vanessa had stolen something from me, but I'd also given away something I couldn't get back by choosing overtime over time with my son. I couldn't blame her for that part. That was on me. 3 years after the divorce, Vanessa asked if we could meet for coffee to talk about Owen and co-parenting. I agreed because we needed to communicate better about his schedule and his needs. We met at a coffee shop halfway between our houses on a Wednesday evening. She looked healthier than the last time I'd seen her, less hollow around the eyes. She told me she'd been sober from gambling for 2 years and was working with a sponsor through a 12-step program. She said she wanted to apologize for everything she'd put me through and that she understood nothing she said would fix what she'd broken. I told her I appreciated the apology, but that I'd moved on and wasn't interested in rehashing the past. She said she understood and that she just wanted to be a better mother to Owen and to co-parent more effectively. We talked about Owen's school and his interests and how to coordinate his schedule. It was civil and practical and completely devoid of the intimacy we'd once shared. When we left, she thanked me for giving her a chance to be in Owen's life. I told her she needed to thank the judge who'd structured her probation with rehabilitation instead of just punishment. 5 years after the divorce, I paid off the last of the debt Vanessa had left me with. My credit score was 708, higher than it had been when we'd bought the Meadowbrook house. Owen was 13 and doing well in school and showing an interest in engineering. Vanessa had paid back $18,000 of the $50,000 she owed, and honestly, I'd stopped counting because the money didn't matter as much as the principal. She was consistent with her visitation and her restitution payments, and Owen had developed a careful relationship with her that included boundaries he'd learned to set himself. He'd told her last year that he forgave her, but that he didn't trust her with money, and she'd accepted that. I'd sold the townhouse and bought a small 3-bedroom house with a backyard where Owen and I played catch on weekends. The house wasn't my dream home, but I'd stopped believing in dream homes. I believed in mortgage payments I could afford, and overtime I chose instead of needed, and weekends I spent with my son instead of at the plant. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.